So, to mark the 1 week anniversary of my new channel on YouTube, Cremin's Corner, I wanted to do something a bit fun. So, I put up on X, where I'm at Daniel Cremin GB, and also through Facebook, where I have a bit of a following on a group that I run. I put up a set of posts asking for questions that I would answer on the new channel. So, let's dive into some of those questions. So first up, we have David Bellamy, who's a really good, very enthusiastic reformer. A lot of people follow him, and he's asking, are there any signs that the recent defection of two Tories previously known for being net zero fanatics is going to lead to a watering down of the Reform UK policy of scrapping net zero immediately upon taking office? So that's interesting. So I think there that David is referring to a former Conservative MP, Jake Berry, who's a former, very briefly, party chairman of the Conservatives, and also to Laura Ann Jones, who is a Welsh AM who defected to the party last week, becoming our first elected representative in our time as Reform UK. So, let's dive into this. So I'm not of the view that you read too much into defections as this leads to, great swings on policy. I think you take things on a case by case basis. I think also that people change over the course of time in politics, and maybe a little bit, maybe there could be an element of opportunism in one or two cases, but people can also change their minds quite legitimately on issues over time. Things that feel really important at a particular moment when there maybe have been a bit of a zeitgeist, for example, in that sort of early period of the 2020s around net zero. Maybe with the kind of passage of time and with force, hindsight, maybe people change their minds to an extent. I think in this particular case, I would not be worried too much as a reformer about these defections leading to a watering down. No, I think it's actually quite timely that today that you're asking that, because today I saw that Richard Tice and Andrea Leadsom have launched a new campaign. I think it's called UK OR, which is UK opposing renewable eyesores in the countryside. So this is about wind farms, obviously, and I think it's solar as well, solar farms, and they are not happy about these developments, and they they want to take them on. So if the deputy leader of the party is fronting up a new campaign of that nature, I think we'll be okay in terms of a strategic shift away from heavily taxpayer and consumer subsidized net zero infrastructure, developing these frequently quite unreliable renewable technologies. I think reform will shift towards a more balanced energy approach that puts greater emphasis on nuclear energy, but also in a transitional period on perhaps on cleaner approaches to oil and gas. So I don't see major changes. And just on Jake in particular, I've met him in the past. I think he's a reasonable bloke. He's useful in a regard in that he has experience behind the scenes in terms of party administration. He was quite involved in CCHQ in a number of capacities over the years, and I think he may be helpful. I don't believe he plans to stand as an MP again, it's been said. So, take people on a case by case basis. But yeah, we don't want a lot of wets coming into the party and diluting it. Totally understand. Moving on to the second question. I have got another question here, and this is by a really good supporter of mine on X. Often retweets me. I really appreciate it. And her handle is at Big Fan of My Kids. Just Call Me Mum is her actual title name, and she's asking, could I share my thoughts on VAT and education? And what she's kind of getting at here as well is, about the charitable status and this idea that Labour are pushing. She says that, that this has always been a tax break, and she doesn't feel that's the case. Well, she's absolutely right. Education was always tax exempt from the very foundation point of VAT being established in this country. I think in very late 80s, early 1990s, there was a core principle, and I think it's even in the, it's just unfathomable that you would charge VAT on private education, particularly when you consider the fact that those who are electing to to privately educate their children, they're saving the taxpayer a huge amount of money, probably the best part of £8,000 a year at least, on their child's education. So if anything, they should be getting a tax credit, not VAT charge. They should be getting some sort of rebate to recognise the contribution they're making to the savings for the UK taxpayer. But let's just also zoom out on this. Would the same people who are so enthusiastic to kind of advocate for charging VAT on private school fees, would they want to apply that to university education? Because if you apply it to school fees, why wouldn't you apply it to the education of both domestic students and international students? Instantly make international student fees 20% more expensive. We're in a slightly ridiculous situation now whereby, we're saying to people who are, incredibly wealthy from overseas, you come here en masse and educate your children. You come here, sorry, you send your children en masse into our university system. And we're talking really significant numbers, 30, 40, sometimes approaching 50% of, undergrad and postgraduate student roles are international students, and they're not paying VAT. But we're saying to, modestly affluent, in most cases, British parents who, are in that position to kind of pay for private school, that you're going to be charged 20% on to have the privilege to educate your child privately. It's just not on, and it's something that Reform has rightly said will not stand under a Reform government. Moving on to the next question. Um, I have another question here, also from the same person, at Big Fan of My Kids. And this is about the latest private sector analysis, the CBI's growth indicator. This is by the CBI, Confederation of British Industry, showing very weak economic growth for most sectors of the economy in the coming months. And my thoughts on this, what's driving it? Well, look, there are some short and long-term drivers of the difficulties that the UK private sector is facing. Very much so, the negativity of the autumn budget and the continued wash-through effects of that have had a significant impact. There has been a lot of job losses already. And there's also been a contraction of economic activity. I think we're all experiencing that slowdown, because when you put up the costs of employing people by, I think in excess of 20% per head of employees, businesses operate on quite tight margins in many sectors. And they're going to have to make that up through unemployment, by making people redundant, but also by reining in what they would have expected to pay in either salary increases or bonuses to make ends meet. So it was a really short-sighted and stupid move on her part. There's also been, various other changes that they've made to the sort of the treatment, of wealth in terms of inheritance tax. These changes are going to lead to a dilution of willingness to invest in the UK, and that has a wash through effect. Both existing, large scale, very wealthy British and international investors, pulling money out and going abroad. But there are also longer term factors. The UK economic model has been on the slide for some time now, and this goes back to the Conservatives. It's not all Labour's fault, although they have made a real rod for their back and compounded the difficulties. We have one of the highest tax burdens that we've had for many decades, since the war, basically. And businesses have faced ever larger sort of demands from an inefficient public sector. And at the end of the day, it's not sustainable. We have low productivity, in part because we also have what we're spending the money on, the public sector money, in terms of education and skills, isn't right. We have a complete mismatch. We have far too many people probably going to university relative to the actual needs of the economy. And we're not taking technical education seriously enough. We're also not taking retraining for the existing adult market seriously enough. So we have huge skills gaps. We don't use our R&D budget as strategically as we should. So there are all sorts of issues. There are things we could do in terms of making R&D much more streamlined and focused on the priority sectors of the economy. while still accepting that there's always going to be some scope for curiosity-driven research by universities, we at the moment we just don't take it seriously enough, and we fritter a lot of money away. There is woeful inefficiency in some of our scientific institutions, national institutes, some of the universities, not all. Some are fantastic, and really do take and sweat the assets that they've got really hard in terms of capital infrastructure. But there are some issues. So yeah, I mean there are some short-term and long-term problems with the UK economy, but yes, it's a bad outlook, and without tax cuts, without a sweeping approach of deregulation in the next few years, I think the situation is just going to get worse. And you have to remember that GDP output is not the same as prosperity. GDP output might trickle up, but it's trickling up because of added consumption, because of really high levels of legal and illegal migration. The real measure to look at is GDP per capita, and that is not doing well, and it hasn't been for many years. So the next question I'm going to have a look at, this comes from Levine, and he was asking, what is the problem for reform going to be? Is there a risk, he says, of a key man risk of over reliance on Nigel Farage, and will voters back the party? And he goes on to say, Nigel Farage is known for being a brilliant political founder, but he hasn't been able to build a lasting political party to kind of get into government in the past. What's different this time? Well, Levine, I would say that in the past, the key thing to understand about UKIP and then the Brexit Party is they were pressure groups. They were pressure groups to achieve single issue goals. The Brexit Party was very much in the same vein, was about shifting the dial and getting Brexit done by getting Theresa May out in those European elections. UKIP was never going to be a catch-all national party, and from the very beginnings, and Farage did not have complete control over it. It was always going to be a kind of more of a pressure group than a political party, and he always had to contend with very much an activist base that was very set in its ways. Reform is much more malleable. It's much more structured in the way Farage has wanted to set it up, and he's slowly but surely building the right team. You can see some really talented people. I mean, you've got Zia Youssef, who is an absolute gem of a find in terms of the work he's doing. Fantastic communicator, really committed to the mission, smart as a whip. So he's great. You've got people like Richard Tice. There would be no reform without Richard Tice. He kept us going through really difficult times, kept the party intact and operational as at least as a concept party. And he's don't do him down. He built the party up in some polls to around 12% before Nigel Farage came back. He did some great work. And I will always acknowledge that others like Ben Habib at that point in time also played a role in that. So never deny that he did his bit as well. And of course David Bull, the chairman, former NHS doctor turned TV presenter, a really good communicator. He's the chairman now. I think he's doing a pretty good job. And then you've got new talents coming through, people like Layla Cunningham, new to the scene. Fantastic earlier this week, taking on Barry Gardiner on television. Amazing work being done through the Britain is Lawless campaign by Layla. Sarah Pochin, our new MP. There are new talents emerging. We also have old talents, people like Colin Sutton, really famous retired detective, really respected, coming forward to be the new policing advisor. So there's a good combination of old and new, and perhaps something borrowed and something blue in one or two cases in terms of some of the defectors coming through. But yeah, I'm very optimistic actually that Farage is building a team. And one of the things that I think that is good is that he's talking about he wants to build a strong executive at the top. He wants to bring in people who are really talented and committed. He doesn't need them all to be career politicians. He doesn't want them all to be MPs. He's going to bring in people who he accepts are going to be there for a time limited period in his cabinet or on his front bench working on very specific issues. And they don't want all the Westminster psychodrama, the power maximization. They just want to focus on getting what they want done. And that's good. So yeah, I'm actually quietly encouraged that Farage can build a team. Now, am I saying that there's never going to be any sparks, never any drama? Am I saying that Farage, is absolutely perfect? Of course not. Farage is a politician. He's a human being. He's as fallible as anybody else, and perhaps there will be personality clashes over time. There will be turf battles, as in any political party, sure. But I think he can get there. And at the moment, yes, if Nigel Farage, if God forbid he toppled over with a heart attack and he was laid up for months, it would take reform would have a hit. Absolutely. It would have an impact on our public level of support. But I don't think it would finish the party off. And I think in a couple of years' time, reform will, and I mean this in the best sense of the word, will really be able to hold its own and step out of Nigel's shadow. It will be a fully functioning, vibrant party. But I want Nigel to be our leader for many years to come, and to be the first Reform Prime Minister. Don't get me wrong, but I think all parties outgrow their founder if they're going to be successful, and I think that Reform will has the potential to do just that. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. So then we have David Godfrey, who's over on Facebook, and he wanted to know my thoughts on how you balance free market principles, which seem to be important to reform, with the need, and this is David's view, and I think as well as some of the leaders in reform, the need to have a strategic approach to things like steel production and key public utilities, where for various reasons the privatisation route seems to have come up short. Good question. So look, I make no bones about this. I am very much spiritually a Thatcherite, and I think that Margaret got a huge amount right when she was Prime Minister in terms of saying there was far too much. The state was trying to do far too much and actually losing the taxpayer a lot of money, putting us more and more on the rack. So a lot of the things that she chose to privatise and that the major government chose to privatise, you can understand the context that they were doing it in. Does that mean that every single form of privatisation that was undertaken was right? No. Certain forms of privatisation worked really well, others not so well. I think I see steel as being absolutely critical to national infrastructure, particularly, it's crucial to national security, in the defence context, but also to our economic security to have a steel making capacity, primary steel, high grade steel used for military purposes. You need that, but also for major civil engineering projects relating to energy, you should have domestic UK security of supply. So I am open to the idea of, a partial or full renationalisation of British steelmaking capacity. Yeah, I'm totally open to that. When it comes to the utilities, I think we've got really, an example of, privatisation doesn't work if you just create a private monopoly when it comes to water. Water is a complete example of failed privatization because you don't have multiple providers in the same region competing to provide the water. You don't. And the private providers that we had, the water companies, have not invested strategically in water reservoirs. We haven't had a new one built, I think, in well over 20 years. So that is an example of failed privatization. And I'm kind of the view, I'm not the view that the state should be, buying them left, right, and centre. But as some of these companies get into trouble, which looks likely in a number of cases in the coming years, perhaps the state should not be bailing them out. Perhaps the state should be saying, go into administration, we'll make an offer to take over from the creditors some of that debt, we'll restructure the business, we'll bring in private sector partners, but they will be incentivized to deliver really good results and to keep the costs low while investing in new infrastructure, keep them as low as possible, run the businesses profitably, sure, but try and offer a better service, and the state will take a share or a sharehold, some sort of stake in them. I'm open to exploring that model. I'm not that much of a purist about the state can never play any role, because ultimately what matters is what works, and we have to be a little bit pragmatic about this. Am I really enthusiastic about the idea of the state running all sorts of electricity companies and providers of services to electricity, providers to your home? No, not massively. It's not personally what I think is the answer, the idea of state-led energy production. Am I open to the idea as we go forward, as we look to reactivate, the North Sea oil and gas fields and perhaps consider fracking on shore as well? Am I open to the idea that the state might have some co-investment in that, a share? I'm reasonably open to the idea if you can show me the economic case of how it's going to be beneficial, not a drag to the taxpayer to do so. But yeah, slightly slightly cautious about the idea of the state as a grand co-developer in all areas. But where there's a natural monopoly, where you can utilize private expertise a bit more efficiently than trying to do it yourself, I'm open to that where it's water and possibly one or two other things. But yeah, the other question I've got from David here, this is another good one. What are your thoughts before we see on how long before we see sitting Conservative MPs realise they're going to lose their seats in 3 or 4 years' time and hence try to jump ship? Does reform accept such people in order to build a bigger parliamentary grouping, or does it put names in place for now for parliamentary candidates for new constituencies? So this is an interesting question. Kemi's low energy approach, he adds, does not really seem to be working at the moment, and I can't believe this topic is not front of mind for many Conservative MPs. Very interesting. So look, how would I kind of approach this most diplomatically? So I've gone back and forth a little bit on this issue of parliamentary defections and how reform should approach them. These days, in the past, I've kind of taken a Bismarckian approach whereby you say, maybe we keep our options open for as long as possible. We don't set, heavy deadlines and all sorts of demands. We're a little bit flexible in our approach to parliamentary defections, be they MPs or peers, about the timescales, and we judge each one on a case by case basis. And that was my mindset. But actually, I think it's such a distraction, this constant emphasis that the media are placing on parliamentary defections. I am more now increasingly of the view of the social commentator and comedian Lee Hurst, and he's a really good guy, and he's very serious in his focus on politics. I must say, despite being a comedian, he takes it's no laughing matter his approach to politics. And smart guy, he feels that reforms should impose a hard deadline on parliamentary defections and concentrate minds, so that if you're serious about joining the party, you should probably be doing so within the next year, possibly even as soon as the party conference season. I'm increasingly open to that sort of perspective, that actually you need to concentrate minds and put to bed all of this and let the party get on then with the full scale parliamentary selections. Because yeah, you're right, it isn't fair if sitting MPs kind of roll up and they expect to take the constituency on as the parliamentary candidate for reform when you've already got somebody in place. It's just going to create lots of local bad blood. So reform have kind of got a bit of a balancing act to think about if there are going to be MPs that come over. But you've also got to think about the mix and the message that it sends. So yeah, I think imposing a hard deadline might not be the worst idea. And it would concentrate, it would force hands, it would concentrate minds. So I'm open to that as an approach to dealing with this. There are some people I would really love to see come over to reform, and the big Kahuna, the big silver tuna in the sea for me would be Lord David Frost. Who played a really key role in getting Brexit done. He's a brilliant man. Really like him. I really like what he stands for. I think he would offer a lot. He's got a really interesting background. He's not dissimilar from me ideologically, but also kind of in making that journey from being, probably more aligned to the sort of establishment, more kind of centrist, moving to the right over time and kind of embracing Thatcherism. So he was a career civil servant, a diplomat who, over time has become incrementally more and more Thatcherite in orientation. And, I think he's really good. I think he would be excellent. I mean, I would still be open potentially to Suella Braverman. I think she's, in her own way, a pretty good communicator, and I think she's as tough as nails. I know there's been some issues of late, some hurt feelings perhaps in one or two quarters over some of our criticism of the Conservative Party's handling of the Cabinet's handling of that super injunction. But Suella would be interesting. There are maybe one or two others in the parliamentary Conservative Party in the Commons that could be compatible. But I'm not desperate to see huge numbers coming. I think one other guy who would be really good, though, actually, is a guy called Stuart Jackson, who used to be a Conservative MP. I believe he's now in the House of Lords. And he is somebody who I also think would offer a lot of value. another one who's kind of gets Brexit, who gets how Parliament runs. People like that, and maybe Lord Moylan as well. Those are the kind of people I would love to see join Reform. But I'm not open to seeing every Tom, Dick, and Harry kind of run across and join the party. Absolutely, you have to be, quite strategic in the approach you take to it. And yeah, there probably will be some people at a later stage maybe looking to do the chicken run. So Reform does need to be a little bit careful about some of this. Then I've got a question from a friend of mine called Nick. Nick Lardeda is his surname. I'm not. I'm never sure if that's actually his real surname or not. He kind of intimated at one point it might not be. I'm not certain. I just know him as Nick. And we chat a fair bit over Facebook chat groups and Core, which is a group I help run. And he asks, I often wonder what the shape of the Parliamentary Labour Party will be as we approach the next general election. He says, I'd guess around 200 of their newly elected first-time MPs must be sitting in Parliament knowing they have near zero chance of defending their seat and have just wasted 5 years of their life, including 5 years of career progression outside of Parliament. Ooh, interesting point. Will they be dutifully loyal to the end, or will they keep just being quiet and sitting it out, or will they, resorting to gallows humour, or will they actually take a stand? Will they go scorched earth against the country and sort of, dial down, I guess, double down on what they care about and try and push the Labour Party, I guess, leftwards? From a Reform UK perspective, how do we use their energy strategically to really turn the screw on them? To kind of drive them, I guess, to distraction. So, look, really interesting. Thank you, Nick. On this, I do think it's entirely possible that Keir Starmer somehow hires the best political strategist in the land, and completely turns the Labour Party around. It's impossible. It's a very small chance that he's going to be the man to do that. Things could change if they change leader. It depends who they would get. It would depend on the agenda they got. But I think under Sir Keir, they are in a pretty bad position now. Whether that results in a Reform majority government is another question. But I think the Labour Party is in difficulties. To an extent, there is this problem of the challenge that they face from their left flank, from the Greens, but also potentially from this now Corbyn startup party. Now, that could fall flat on its face, or it could be pretty effective. It really depends on who's Corbyn's really got running it and how serious they are. I think the Your Party transitional placeholder name stuff, general hilarity ensued. But watch this space on that. We'll see what happens. Bringing it around to what Reform can do in this environment and kind of exposing sort of divisions. Well, to begin with, I don't think there are many Labour MPs in the Commons who are itching to join Reform. So I don't think we're going to bring many across to our vein of thinking. And I certainly wouldn't want to bring that Tory MP, Christian Wakefield, or whatever his name is, who defected from the Tories to Labour. I certainly wouldn't want him packing his bags and joining us. Don't know about anybody else. I would be very careful about who we even consider accepting from Labour, either in the Lords or in the Commons. There are one or two, sound based old social democrats, but not too many. In terms of disrupting the Labour Party and driving them to distraction, Farage is fantastic at making the political weather, so it's entirely possible that he can drive them to distraction. But Reform has that disadvantage in parliamentary terms of we're not the official opposition. We don't have those opposition day debates. We don't have the select committee kind of tools, the chairships and the membership composition. So we have to do our politics through social media and on the airwaves. And we can drive them to distraction. We can sort of set agendas. We can try and, box clever in Parliament to an extent. But, ultimately, I think it's almost stand back and watch the parliamentary bun fight amongst the Labour Party as the pressure keeps mounting. I always say, don't focus on playing the opposition's game. Focus on our own strengths. Focus on playing our own game to the best of our ability and let them tear themselves apart, which I think they will. They are obsessed, Keir Starmer in particular, with what reform is doing. It's why they're mentioning us in every Prime Minister's questions. They can read polls, they can read focus groups as well as we can, and they can see the direction of travel is towards a realignment in this country, towards reform. So we've just got to keep doing what we're doing and not get too sort of, hung up and focused, purely on what others are doing. Then I've got a question from Tom Jardine on Facebook. What's your thoughts on migrant hotels, which the Tories founded? Well, you know, what a legacy of 14 years of a party that talked about strong border controls, and bringing net migration down to the tens of thousands when they left office close to 1 million. Now, of course, much of that was legal migration, but there are huge issues with illegal migration, but also with low skilled legal migration, and also with the overstaying problem. We can get onto that on another day, I guess. But on this very specific question of migrant hotels, but also I guess HMOs and what we do about it. Well, I'm of the view that if you come here illegally, if you cross the channel, I take the Farage view on this. I take the view of every reformer, I imagine, which is you should have no right to asylum. You can be deported back to France or to your country of origin, and you can make your claim there. You're not in any imminent danger. I think we should be using the Royal Navy to escort the boats back to France. And I think we should go in force, and we should be really steady and robust about making that clear. If they're an ally of ours, they will cooperate. They'll have to, because we can impose economic sanctions. We can make life very difficult if they don't want to play ball. I think we have to be willing to be robust. I think there'll be difficult conversations. And if we're not willing to have them, we might as well pack up and go home. As regards what we do about the existing situation, well, I think there needs to be, some creative solutions. Obviously, we're not in power yet, but I would be saying let's try and make the case to Labour to start doing offshore processing. We need to get these people, into offshore centres if we can for safe processing and return to their own country. And we need to be much more robust in the way we're looking at asylum policies. Once reform gets in, I would say let's have a root and branch review of what, if anything, we want to offer in terms of asylum and refugee kind of status in the future, the policy framework for that. It should very much be on our terms, and it must never be seen as a universal right to asylum again in this country. We need to, disapply, if necessary, withdraw from the UN conventions and accept that those things were written 70 odd years ago. We need to be, very clear that if you are in this country, it is a privilege, not a right. It is conditional on your behaviour. As regards what we do about the migrant hotels, I think we need to enhance security around them. I think we need to be much more diligent about prioritising the safety of our people. We have to be, really straightforward about that. There are some very serious issues, and I do worry about the state of the country. But I appeal to people to be calm. You don't need to get, really. You don't need to get yourself into trouble. I hope people will be measured about this issue and not resort to violence, not resort to really hateful language. But it is concerning that the state of security, public order, public safety, I should say, in regards to the use of migrant hotels and large scale HMOs in places that are totally inappropriate. I think we have to be creative in the approach we take in the short run to alleviating some of those problems and deterring people. But in the long run, when reform gets in, we need an entirely new approach. That's probably it for the moment. I believe I'll just check if there's any more questions I haven't picked up on. Oh yes, one more. Sorry, Rob Wilson asks on X. I'd be interested in Reform's approach to the health service. Obviously, a contentious area with Labour waiting to attack any type of reform as privatising the NHS. Dead right, Rob. Yeah. So look. Reform's position as regards healthcare reform has definitely evolved since the return of Nigel Farage. I'm a big admirer of Richard Tice, but I think he was playing a little bit fast and loose, a little bit too populist with some of the kind of pre-election pledges in 2023 around, I think, tax write-offs of student loans and things like that, for, I think it was tax exemptions and possibly student loan write-offs for doctors and nurses, various kind of love the NHS sort of policies. I think we need to be realistic. I think social attitudes on the NHS are changing very rapidly as the service creaks and gets worse. I think we're reaching the point where we can start to have a grown-up conversation. I hate that term grown-up, but actually it applies here. I hate when politicians at the side use the term we're the adults in the room or the grown-ups. But in this particular case, I will use it. I think we're, no longer going to be infantilized in the debate on healthcare reform as we were, sort of, held back by these very sort of childish NHS, I love the NHS lapel wearing brigade on the centre right, like Jeremy Hunt. I think things have moved on. I think people are harder because they have to be, and are thinking more seriously. Look, I don't worship at the feet of the NHS like some people. I think it, some aspects of it are fantastic, some aspects of it aren't. I think it's the only healthcare in the world apart from North Korea and Cuba, where it's a fully state operated primary healthcare system, completely sort of state, taxpayer sort of funded. And almost every other system in the world is a mixed economy model. Now, obviously, we do have private healthcare provision, but it's pretty small by international standards. I like where reform is going with its emphasis on tax credits, I believe, for tax break for using private healthcare. I think that beyond that, Farage's idea of social insurance, of kind of moving to a mixed model, whereby it will still be free at the point of need, particularly A&E for those in serious condition, and that you will not be paying tens of thousands if your child or your grandmother is very sick and needs an operation. That won't happen. But whereby you won't be personally out of pocket, but whereby we kind of move to a more mixed payer model, whereby through employment and also through a sort of form of social insurance for those unemployed or retired, we move to a mixed payer model. I would be open to that. But the thing for me as well is we need to think very differently about the NHS workforce. We need to think about how reducing reliance, and it's not fair on the countries we're taking it from. We take huge number of really talented people from developing world countries, and we leave their healthcare system short in order to to staff hours up when we're not training enough of our own people to be nurses and doctors. We turn away really well qualified school leavers who've got the intelligence to be doctors. We turn them away in droves. And then we end up recruiting. We don't even recruit that. We don't even educate that many international students. We also cap those numbers because of this bizarre formula that we've got for the, whereby it costs a huge amount in the UK to train a doctor, much more than many other countries. So there's just so much we could do better. The NHS workforce needs to be looked at. We need to really get productivity moving. I would also say the other thing that I would love reform to do, if it were up to me, is ban the BMA and the Royal College of Nursing and others from engaging in strikes. I think that's a really long overdue reform. If you're telling me that the NHS is literally a life and death service and it's the lifeblood of this country and it's critical national infrastructure and all of that, then why on earth do you think it's okay to strike? We do not allow policemen, and we do not allow soldiers to strike. Why are we allowing doctors and nurses? The same policies that apply to police officers and to soldiers and to other members of the military branches should apply to those who work in the NHS, particularly on the clinical side. We just need to think differently. We need to be much more robust, we need to just be harder edged in the negotiations on pay and pensions. We've been a soft touch for many, many years, and that's got to change. But we also, the other thing I would just say on the NHS is we need to be better at, rolling out new technologies, embedding them. We need to get the training infrastructure right for adoption of new treatments and technologies. And we need to also remember the importance of choice and voice in the NHS. That's gone neglected for too long. I think, to be fair, under Tony Blair, Alan Milburn, John Reid, we really were making some strides forward in terms of utilising competition to bring waiting times down in the NHS. That all got abandoned under Gordon Brown and then David Cameron. There was a brief experiment under Andrew Lansley that didn't end well. The Tories panicked at the first sign of public unease about the reforms whipped up by the media and sort of ran in the other direction and have become ever more centralised in their approach. And it's just so not healthy. to kind of not utilize private sector expertise and to kind of bring waiting times down. So I'm really for using choice in the system, offering people the opportunity to have an operation faster in another part of the same region or in another region if it can be done. I'm open to using independent sector treatment centres. We just need to be novel. We just need to be hidebound by this, free at the point of need, everything done by good old NHS. We need to be much more with it, much more awake and alive to the reality we face. And we also just, have to think about social care differently. And I could talk about that at great length, but I'll leave it for now. But just say this: I think the opening is there, and I think reform needs to be bold and lead a conversation on NHS reform and moving to a more mixed economy approach, whereby we will still protect those who do not have the means. We will still ensure healthcare is free at the point of need for the society at large, but that we will find ways to economically account for it in a different way. So yeah, that's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm really enjoying the channel. Thank you for all the support. Thank you for the subscribes that I've had to date and the engagement. Let's keep it going. Really appreciate it. Thank you.